The man was a portrait of respectability, sculpted from good breeding and expensive tailoring. Dr. Alistair Finch. The name itself felt solid, trustworthy, like old money and oak-paneled offices. He sat in the corner booth of the Harmony Creek Diner, a place far too humble for his polished shoes and cashmere sweater. His smile was a practiced, brilliant thing he bestowed upon the other patrons, who greeted him with the kind of reverence small towns reserve for their most esteemed citizens. He was a pillar, a rock. The boy was a ghost. He sat opposite the doctor, small and silent, a faded photograph in a gilded frame. His name was Leo, and he was 8 years old, though he looked closer to 6. His clothes, clean but worn thin at the knees and elbows, hung from his slight frame as if borrowed from a larger, happier child. A faint, yellowish bruise, the ghost of a past injury, clung to the sharp line of his cheekbone, a detail most people's eyes would slide right over. His own eyes, a deep and soulful blue, were fixed on the untouched plate of lukewarm fries before him. They did not blink. They did not wander. They simply stared, as if the answers to every unspeakable question were hidden in the greasy potatoes. Sarah watched them from behind the counter, a damp rag clutched in her hand. She had been a waitress here for 10 years. She knew the rhythm of this town, the cadence of its heart. She knew who was cheating on their spouse, who was struggling with the bottle, who was praying for rain for their crops. She was an observer, a silent confessor who traded secrets for tips and a kind word. And she knew something was profoundly wrong in booth 4. It wasn't one thing. It was 1,000 tiny, terrible things. It was the way Dr. Finch's hand rested on Leo's shoulder, not as a gesture of affection, but as a clamp, a subtle anchor of control. It was the way the boy flinched, an infinitesimal tremor, when the doctor's voice, so warm and charming to everyone else, dropped a single cold degree when he spoke to him. "Eat, Leo. Don't be difficult." It was the hunger in the boy's eyes, a cavernous, desperate thing that fought against the ironclad stillness of his body. He was starving, yet he would not eat. Sarah had seen that kind of fear before, in stray dogs that had been kicked one too many times. They would shy away from the offered hand, the bowl of food, because they had learned that kindness was often just the prelude to more pain. Paragraphs. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a small cage. She looked around the diner. People were laughing, talking, sipping coffee. They saw a respected pediatrician treating his orphaned nephew to a meal. A sad story, but a heartwarming one. The good doctor stepping up. They didn't see the boy's terror. They didn't see the predator's smile. A local police officer, Officer Miller, strolled in, grabbing a coffee to go. He saw Dr. Finch and his face lit up. "Doc, good to see you. How's the golf swing?" "Getting rusty, Dave," Finch chuckled, the sound smooth as polished marble. "This little man is taking up all my time." He ruffled Leo's hair, and the boy's entire body went rigid. Sarah tried to catch Miller's eye. She widened her own, trying to telegraph the silent scream building in her chest. "Look closer. Look at the boy." But Miller was already laughing at a joke, Finch told, clapping the doctor on the back. He paid for his coffee and left, oblivious. The system had failed. The normal world was blind. Her gaze swept the room again, a desperate search for an ally. It landed on him, the biker. He sat alone in a booth by the window, a monolith of black leather and faded denim. He was huge, with shoulders that seemed to strain the very architecture of the small diner. Tattoos, intricate webs of ink and memory, snaked up his neck and disappeared into a thick, salt and pepper beard. A long, healed scar cut a pale path through one eyebrow, giving him a permanent look of grim contemplation. His vest was adorned with a single large patch, a roaring bear, its claws extended. Beneath it, a smaller patch read simply, "Bear." He had been there for an hour, nursing a single cup of black coffee. He didn't talk. He didn't read the paper. He just watched. And unlike everyone else, he wasn't looking at the respectable doctor. He was looking at the ghost. Bear saw it all. He saw the tremble in the boy's hand as it hovered over a glass of water. He saw the way the boy's gaze darted to the door, a prisoner mapping out an impossible escape. He saw the uncle's smile, a perfectly crafted mask that didn't quite fit, revealing glimpses of the cold emptiness behind it. Bear had seen that emptiness before. He'd seen it in the eyes of men in war-torn villages, men who had lost their humanity piece by piece. He'd seen it in the faces of predators he'd dealt with in a life before this one, a life he tried not to think about. It was the look of someone who saw other people not as human beings, but as objects, tools, obstacles. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, pierced through him. A small hand in his, a bright, laughing face, a pink bicycle with training wheels, a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and despair. He pushed it down, burying it under layers of scar tissue and miles of open road. But the echo remained. The duty, the promise he had made to a ghost of his own. He felt a presence and looked up. It was the waitress, Sarah. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she held out the check for Dr. Finch. "Whenever you're ready, doctor," she said, her voice a little too tight. Finch gave her his 1,000-watt smile. "Thank you, my dear." He reached for his wallet, his attention momentarily diverted. In that split second, Sarah moved. Her hand, holding the billfold for Bear, darted out. She didn't place it on his table. She placed it directly in his large, calloused hand. Her fingers brushed his, and he felt the frantic, desperate energy coming off her. It was a plea, silent and raw. Bear took the billfold. His eyes met hers. He saw her fear, her resolve, her desperate hope. He gave her a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was barely a movement, but it was a contract, an acknowledgement. "I see it too." A wave of relief so profound it almost made her dizzy washed over Sarah. She backed away, returning to the counter, her legs feeling like jelly. Finch paid, leaving a generous tip, the perfect gentleman to the very end. He stood, pulling Leo to his feet with that same tight grip on his shoulder. "Come along, Leo. Time to go home." As they walked past Bear's booth, the boy's eyes, for the first time, lifted from the floor. They met Bear's for a fraction of a second. In their depths, Bear saw a universe of terror, a silent scream for help that was louder than any sound he had ever heard. Then they were gone. Bear didn't move. He sat there as the diner slowly emptied out, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He opened the billfold. Tucked inside, beside his small check for 1 coffee, was a neatly folded napkin. He smoothed it out on the table. The handwriting was shaky, hurried. 4 words. "The boy is scared. Help." He stared at the note, the paper a stark white against the dark wood of the table. He felt the old rage, the cold, quiet fury he had spent years trying to tame, begin to stir in his belly. It was a familiar feeling, a sleeping giant woken from its slumber. He waited. He knew the waitress would come. An hour later, the last of the staff had left. Sarah flipped the sign on the door to "Closed" and locked it. She took a deep, shuddering breath and walked over to his booth, pulling a chair from another table and sinking into it. She looked exhausted, like she had been holding her breath for a week. "Thank you for staying," she whispered, her voice fragile as thin ice. Bear folded the napkin carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket, placing it over his heart. "Tell me," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. It wasn't a question, it was an order. And so she did. The words came tumbling out, a torrent of observation and fear she had held back for weeks. "He started coming in about 6 months ago," she began, her hands twisting in her lap. "Right after Leo's parents, right after the accident. Dr. Finch told everyone he was taking him in. Everyone said how wonderful he was." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "At first, it seemed okay. Leo was quiet, but he'd just lost his parents. Of course he was quiet. But then, it changed. He got thinner, paler. He always has that look in his eyes, like a cornered animal." She described the little things, the details that alone meant nothing, but together painted a horrifying picture. The way Finch would order a lavish steak for himself and a plain cheese sandwich for the boy, then chide him for not finishing it. The time Leo came in on a cold November day, wearing only a thin sweatshirt, shivering, while Finch was bundled in a thick, expensive-looking coat. "A few weeks ago," she continued, her voice dropping lower, "he had a cast on his wrist. A little hairline fracture," Finch said. Laughed it off. "Boys will be boys. You know how they get into scrapes. But Leo, he held that arm so carefully, like it was made of glass. And when I accidentally brushed against it when I was clearing the table, he cried out. It wasn't a loud cry. It was just a little gasp of pain. But Finch's eyes, they went cold. He looked at me, and for a second I felt I felt afraid. Bear listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone. But his hands, resting on the table, had clenched into fists, his knuckles white. The coffee in his mug had long gone cold. His parents, Bear said, his voice flat. The accident. A car crash, Sarah confirmed. Head on. They died instantly. It was all over the local paper. Tragic. They were good people. They owned a small tech company, did very well for themselves. Everyone said they had a massive life insurance policy to make sure Leo was taken care of, no matter what. There it was, the final greasy piece of the puzzle. Greed. It was always greed, in one form or another. I tried to say something, Sarah said, shame and frustration coloring her tone. I mentioned to Officer Miller once that the boy seemed awfully sad. He just shrugged, said Finch was a great guy, a pillar of the community, and that the kid was probably just still grieving. He made me feel stupid, hysterical. She looked at Bear, her eyes pleading. Am I crazy? Am I seeing things that aren't there? Bear reached across the table, his large, rough hand covering hers. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a solid, reassuring weight. You're not crazy, he said, his voice low and firm. You're the only one who's been paying attention. He held her gaze, his eyes clear and resolute. In them she saw no doubt, no hesitation, only a chilling, absolute certainty. We're going to handle this, he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a comforting platitude. It was a promise. A vow sealed in the quiet, empty diner, witnessed only by the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten conversations. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice a bare whisper. Bear stood up, his sheer size seeming to shrink the room around him. He was a mountain of righteous indignation. First, he said, pulling his phone from his pocket, I make a call. He looked down at her, his expression softening for just a moment. You did the right thing, Sarah, the brave thing. Now you stay here, lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me. He walked to the door, unlocked it, and stepped out into the cool night air. The neon diner sign cast a red glow on his weathered leather vest. He stood under the lonely street lamp, a solitary guardian against the encroaching darkness. He dialed a number from memory. It rang once. Sarge, a calm, professional voice answered. There was no greeting. None was needed. Sarge, Bear rumbled. It's me. I've got a code lamb. There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that denotes a shift from passive to active. A code lamb was their highest priority. It meant a child was in imminent danger. It was a call to arms that superseded everything else. Location? Sarge asked, his voice already laced with cold precision. Town of Harmony Creek. The subject is a Dr. Alistair Finch. Understood, Sarge said. Give me the vitals on the lamb. His name is Leo, Bear said, the boy's terrified eyes flashing in his mind. 8 years old, orphaned. Uncle is the guardian and, I believe, the threat. Financial motive is likely. Insurance. Copy that, Sarge said. ETA for the Vanguard is 90 minutes. Full contingent by sunrise. We're on our way, brother. The line went dead. Bear slipped the phone back into his pocket. He looked up at the stars, cold and distant in the night sky. The promise had been made. Now, the thunder would roll. For the next hour, Harmony Creek slept, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering on its borders. Then, the first sign appeared. A pair of headlights cresting the hill on the old state highway. Then another pair, and another. Soon, it was a river of light, a silent, steady procession flowing into the valley. They didn't roar into town. There was no guttural explosion of engines, no display of chaotic force. This was not a mob. This was an army. They rolled in with a discipline that was almost unnerving, their engines a low, collective hum, like the sound of a gathering storm. They were the guardians of the innocent, a brotherhood forged not in bars and brawls, but in shared principles and a rigid, unshakable code. They came from all walks of life, a fact hidden beneath the uniform of leather and denim. In the column of riders was a high school principal, a pediatric nurse, a corporate CEO who had excused himself from a late-night board meeting, a master electrician, a retired homicide detective, and a quiet, unassuming man who was one of the state's top digital forensics experts. They were fathers, grandfathers, uncles, and brothers, and they were all here for one reason: the code lamb. They assembled in the large, empty parking lot of a defunct textile mill on the edge of town, a pre-designated staging area for the region. 160 bikes parked in neat, orderly rows. The men dismounted, their movements economical and purposeful. They gathered in small groups, their voices low. The air crackled with a quiet, controlled energy. A tall, lean man with a neatly trimmed gray beard and the sharp, intelligent eyes of a hawk approached Bear. This was Sarge, the club's president and chief strategist, a man who had spent 20 years in military intelligence orchestrating operations far more complex than this. "Bear," he said, his voice calm. "Report." Bear stood with Sarge, Deacon, the retired detective, and a man known only as Glitch, the tech wizard. They huddled under the dim light of the parking lot, a map of Harmony Creek spread on the hood of a dusty pickup truck. "The witness is a waitress," Bear explained, his voice a low growl. "Credible. She's been observing the subject and the boy for months. Her name is Sarah. She's locked in the diner, waiting." Deacon, a man whose face was a roadmap of cynical experience, nodded slowly. "A respected doctor. The worst kind. They build a fortress of goodwill around themselves. It makes them almost untouchable." "Almost," Sarge corrected him, his eyes glinting in the dark. He tapped the map, on a pristine suburban street called Maple Drive. "This is Finch's residence. Glitch, what have you got?" Glitch, a man who looked more like a Silicon Valley programmer than a biker, was already typing on a ruggedized laptop. "I'm in," he said softly. Not into his personal devices, not yet, but his public footprint and financial data are illuminating. Dr. Finch is drowning in debt. 2 bad real estate investments, a portfolio decimated by risky stock trades. He's been liquidating assets for the last 3 months, but he hasn't touched his own house. Foreclosure notice was served 2 weeks ago, but he got a last-minute extension. "The insurance policy," Bear stated. "Exactly," Glitch confirmed. Leo's parents had a $7 million policy, beneficiary, Leo, in a trust managed by a third-party firm. Finch is the legal guardian, but he can't touch the principal. The trust disperses funds for Leo's care, but it's tightly controlled. However, Glitch paused, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "There's a clause. In the event of the beneficiary's death before the age of 25, the full amount of the trust reverts to the legal guardian." A cold, heavy silence fell over the group. $7 million. The price of a child's life. "He's not just neglecting him," Deacon murmured, his voice grim. "He's waiting. Or worse, he's planning to accelerate the timeline." "The waitress mentioned something else," Bear added. "Finch bragged to another customer about soundproofing his basement for a home theater." Sarge's eyes narrowed. "A home theater in a house heading for foreclosure. Unlikely." He looked at the assembled men, his gaze sweeping over their determined faces. "All right, here's the plan. This has to be clean, airtight. We give the local law no excuse to paint us as the villains. We don't use force, we use pressure." He laid out the strategy with military precision. Phase 1, intelligence. "Deacon, you're up. I want you to make soft contact. Talk to the neighbors at dawn. The early morning dog walkers, the joggers. Don't push, just listen. See what they've seen. Talk to the postal worker, the sanitation crew. People see things. Glitch, I want everything you can find. Deep dive. Social media, hidden accounts, any communication he's had about his finances or the boy. I want to know what he had for breakfast." Deacon and Glitch nodded in unison. Phase 2, the watch, Sarge continued. "We establish a 24/7 surveillance net on the house. 4-man teams, 2-hour shifts. We use the comms. Nothing goes in or out of that house without being logged. Every car, every delivery, every twitch of a curtain. But we stay discreet. We use the woods behind the property, the houses of neighbors we can trust. We are ghosts." He paused, letting the orders sink in. "And phase 3, he said, his voice dropping, becoming harder. Forcing the hand. All this," he gestured to the laptop and Deacon's notepad, "is to build a foundation. We need probable cause to get inside that house. Legally. The local PD is compromised by the doctor's reputation. So we will give them a reason to act that they cannot ignore. We will make it more politically dangerous for them to not get a warrant than to get one. Bear looked at the faces of his brothers, illuminated by the cold glow of the laptop screen. He saw no fear, no hesitation. He saw only a quiet, steely resolve. He saw 160 men who had drawn a line in the sand. "Let's go to work," Sarge said. The sun rose over Harmony Creek, revealing a town that looked exactly as it had the day before. Birds sang, sprinklers hissed on perfectly manicured lawns. But something was different. There was a new energy in the air, an unseen, unspoken tension. On Maple Drive, a woman walking her golden retriever noticed a man sitting in a parked car down the street. He was just reading a paper, but he hadn't been there yesterday. The mailman, on his morning route, felt eyes on him as he delivered the mail to the Finch house, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. Deacon, looking like a retiree out for a morning stroll, struck up a conversation with an elderly man tending his roses. "Morning," Deacon said with a friendly smile. "Beautiful day. Say, I'm thinking of moving to the neighborhood. Quiet street?" "Oh, the quietest," the man said proudly. "Good people here. We've got Dr. Finch right there. A saint, that man. Took in his nephew after that awful tragedy." "A saint," Deacon repeated, his eyes neutral. "I'm sure. The boy must be a handful. I've got grandkids myself." The man leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Well, between you and me, he's a strange one. Very quiet. Never see him playing outside. The doctor says he's just sensitive. Still grieving, you know. Sometimes, though, sometimes at night, I think I hear things. From their basement. The doctor's putting in a home theater, so there's banging and such. But sometimes, it sounds like crying." Deacon's heart turned to a cold stone. "Crying," he echoed softly. He thanked the man and moved on, his friendly demeanor a perfect disguise for the cold fury building inside him. Meanwhile, Glitch, set up in a van parked a block away, was peeling back the layers of Dr. Alistair Finch's digital life. He found the deleted search histories. Countries with no U.S. extradition 2023. How to induce cardiac arrest with household chemicals. Undetectable poisons. He found emails to shady lenders begging for more time. He found a draft of a letter to the trust fund, reporting a decline in Leo's health and requesting additional funds for specialized experimental treatments. Sarge collated the information, his face grim. They had enough. It was time for Phase 3. The next morning, the psychological siege began. It started not with a bang, but with a presence. At precisely 7 a.m., the Guardians moved from the shadows into the light. They didn't roar down the street. They rolled one by one onto Maple Drive, their engines cut as soon as they parked. They lined both sides of the street, a silent, unmoving cordon of leather and steel. They didn't block driveways. They didn't stand on anyone's lawn. They simply stood by their bikes, arms crossed, watching the house at number 12. 160 men, a silent, intimidating vigil. The neighborhood awoke to the surreal sight. Curtains twitched. Phones began to ring. The quiet, peaceful rhythm of Maple Drive was shattered. The silence of the bikers was more terrifying than any noise they could have made. It was the silence of judgment. The silence of patient, unwavering resolve. Inside number 12, Alistair Finch, dressed in his immaculate suit, ready for a day of healing the sick, looked out his window. His hand, holding a coffee cup, began to shake. The charming mask he wore for the world flickered. He saw the bikers. He saw their vests. He saw their eyes, all fixed on his home. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He snatched his phone and dialed 911. "There's a gang!" he shrieked, his voice losing its polished veneer. "A biker gang. They've surrounded my house. Send someone. They're terrifying my boy." Minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled onto the street. Officer Miller, the same officer from the diner, got out, his face a mixture of annoyance and apprehension. He looked at the silent army of bikers, and his bravado wavered. "All right, what's all this?" he demanded, trying to sound authoritative. "You people need to clear out. You're disturbing the peace." Sarge stepped forward, moving with a calm, deliberate grace that commanded attention. Counsel, the club's lawyer, a sharp man in a suit that looked as expensive as Finch's, flanked him. "Officer Miller," Sarge said, his voice even, "we are not disturbing the peace. We are standing on a public street." "You're intimidating a private citizen," Miller shot back. "Dr. Finch is a respected member of this community." "Is he?" Counsel interjected smoothly. He held up a tablet. "Officer, we have reason to believe that a child, Leo Finch, is in grave danger inside that house." He proceeded to lay out their findings with chilling, legal precision. The debt, the insurance policy, the deleted search histories about poisons and extradition. He presented a signed affidavit from the neighbor who heard crying from the basement. Miller was flustered, out of his depth. The situation was spiraling beyond a simple public disturbance call. Just then, the front door of the house flew open. Alistair Finch stormed out, his face purple with rage. His mask was gone, shattered by fear and fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at Sarge. "Get these thugs away from my home. They are harassing me. They are terrifying my boy." Bear, who had been standing silently by his bike, a mountain of quiet menace, took a slow step forward. Every eye turned to him. His presence was immense, his anger a palpable force. "Where is Leo, Doctor?" Bear's voice was a low growl, a rumble that seemed to come from the very earth beneath his feet. Finch's eyes, wild with panic, darted towards Bear. The sight of the giant biker, the man from the diner, seemed to unhinge him completely. All his practiced charm, all his manipulative skill, evaporated in a cloud of pure, venomous rage. "He is in his room where he belongs," Finch screamed, his voice cracking. "He is my ward, my responsibility. He is my property until he is of age. You have no right to interfere. He belongs to me." The words hung in the stunned silence. "My property belongs to me." The air seemed to freeze. Officer Miller stared at Finch, and for the first time, he didn't see the respected doctor. He saw the monster. The mask had not just slipped. Finch had torn it off himself and stomped it into the dust. Counsel, seizing the moment, stepped toward the officer. "Officer," he said, his voice sharp and clear, "that is the statement you needed. A child is not property. We have more than enough for a welfare check and an emergency warrant. Or do you need more?" He held out a pre-written warrant application, detailing every piece of evidence they had gathered. Miller looked from Finch's contorted, hateful face to the 160 silent, judging eyes of the bikers. He looked at the warrant in Counsel's hand. He finally understood. The political danger had shifted. It was now infinitely more dangerous for him to do nothing. He snatched the application and his radio. "Dispatch," he said, his voice tight with a new, urgent clarity. "I need a judge, now. I'm requesting an immediate emergency warrant for 12 Maple Drive, child endangerment." The warrant came through in minutes, a testament to the overwhelming evidence Counsel had provided. 2 more police cars arrived, this time with a senior detective. The system, prodded and forced into action, was finally beginning to work. The detective conferred with Sergeant Miller, then turned to the front door. "Dr. Finch," he announced, "we have a warrant to enter your premises and check on the welfare of Leo Finch." Finch just stood on his lawn, trembling, a cornered rat. The police entered the house. Bear and Sarge followed, their status as concerned citizens who had initiated the call, giving them the right to observe. The house was immaculate, sterile. It felt less like a home and more like a showroom. "Leo?" the detective called out. "Leo, it's the police. We're here to help." Silence. They checked the upstairs bedrooms. One was clearly the master suite, the other was Leo's. It was sparse, almost monastic. A single bed, neatly made. A small dresser with nothing on it. No toys, no books, no drawings on the wall. It was the room of a child who had learned not to have possessions, not to leave a mark. The boy was not there. A cold dread began to creep into the room. "The basement," Bear growled. They went downstairs. The door to the basement was at the end of a hallway. It was new, solid oak, and it was fitted with a heavy industrial deadbolt. A deadbolt on the outside. The detective's face hardened. "Finch doesn't have a key on him," Miller reported from outside. "Says he lost it." "Break it down," the detective ordered. An officer slammed a battering ram into the door. The sound echoed through the silent house. Once. Twice. On the third impact, the wood splintered and the door flew open. They stared into the home theater. The room was just as Sarah had inadvertently described. The walls were thick with soundproofing foam. There were no windows. There was no screen, no projector, no comfortable chairs. There was only a bare concrete floor, a single exposed light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and in the far corner, a small, stained cot. And the room was empty. A wave of collective horror washed over the men. They were too late. He had moved him. Bear felt a surge of ice-cold panic, the kind he hadn't felt in years. He scanned the room, his eyes desperate, searching for any sign, any clue. "Wait," a voice said from the doorway. It was Glitch. He held up a device that looked like a souped-up tricorder. "I'm getting a signal, a faint one. Low-power GPS." "A tracker?" the detective asked, stunned. "Like the ones they use for parolees," Glitch confirmed, moving into the room, following the beeping of his device. "The signal is weak. It's close. It's down." He stopped over the cot in the corner. "It's coming from under here." Bear lunged forward and threw the cot aside. It clattered against the far wall. Beneath it, on the concrete floor, was a section of flooring that didn't quite match. There was a thin, almost invisible seam. He dug his fingers into the crack and pulled. A square section of the concrete floor lifted up. It was a hidden panel, a trap door. The stench that rose from the opening was foul, the smell of stale air, fear, and human misery. Bear peered into the darkness. It was a crawl space, no more than 3 feet high. And in the corner, huddled into a tight ball, was Leo. He was alive. He was wearing a dirty t-shirt and shorts. Around his ankle was a black plastic bracelet with a small blinking LED, the GPS tracker. He looked up, his eyes wide with terror in the sudden light. But then his eyes found Bear. He saw the man from the diner, the man with the kind, sad eyes, the man who had nodded at the waitress. And the terror in his own eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else, a dawning, impossible hope. Bear didn't hesitate. He swung his legs into the hole, lowering his huge frame into the cramped, dark space. He moved slowly, deliberately, not wanting to frighten the boy further. "It's okay, son," he said, his voice a soft, gentle rumble. "We're here. You're safe now." As he got closer, he saw what else was in the crawl space with the boy. Stacked neatly against the dirt wall were dozens of cardboard file boxes. The detective shone his flashlight into the space. The boxes were labeled, not with names, but with numbers. He reached in and pulled one out, opening it. It was a medical file, a child's medical file. He pulled out another, and another. They weren't just Leo's files. There were files on dozens of other children. Former patients of Dr. Alistair Finch. Children from other towns, other counties, going back 15 years. Each file contained detailed medical notes, insurance documents, and, tucked in the back, a death certificate. Cause of death: sudden infant death syndrome. Cause of death: complications from a rare genetic disorder. Cause of death: accidental fall. The horrifying truth crashed down on them. Leo wasn't the first. He was just the latest. Finch wasn't just a greedy monster waiting for an inheritance. He was a serial predator, a medical murderer who used his position of trust to profit from the deaths of the most vulnerable. He had been hiding his trophies, his case files, in a tomb with his next intended victim. Up on the lawn, when the detective emerged from the house, his face ashen, and announced what they had found, Alistair Finch finally broke. He didn't just scream, he howled, a raw animal sound of pure narcissistic fury at being caught. He was clapped in irons, his bespoke suit rumpled and stained, his face a mask of pathetic, impotent rage. Down in the darkness, Bear reached out his hand. "Come on, Leo," he said softly. "Let's get you out of here." Leo, who had not spoken a word, who had not moved a muscle, slowly uncurled himself. He reached out a small, trembling hand and placed it in Bear's. His touch was as light as a feather. Bear gently lifted the boy into his arms. He was shockingly light. He wrapped his arms around Bear's thick neck and buried his face in the worn leather of his vest, clinging to him with a strength that belied his fragile frame. As Bear carried him up out of the hole, out of the basement, out of that house of horrors and into the bright, clean sunlight, a sound was heard from the crowd of bikers. It wasn't a cheer. It was a low, rumbling growl, the collective sound of 160 engines starting at once. It was a sound of victory, a sound of justice, a sound that told the world that the lamb was safe and the wolf was in chains. The trial was a formality. The evidence found in the basement was a prosecutor's dream. The files constituted a meticulous record of Finch's monstrous career. Digital forensics experts recovered the deleted data from his computers, presenting the court with a timeline of his research into undetectable poisons that correlated perfectly with the sudden illnesses of several of his victims. Financial investigators traced the insurance payouts, a trail of blood money that led directly to Finch's offshore accounts and failed investments. He had been using the death benefits of children to fund his lavish lifestyle and cover his gambling debts for over a decade. Sarah's testimony was pivotal. She stood in the witness box, her voice clear and steady, and recounted the small, terrifying details she had observed. She told the jury not about a monster, but about a frightened boy who wouldn't eat his fries. Her simple, honest observations painted a more damning picture than any financial chart could. The most powerful moment of the trial, however, came from a place of silence. When the prosecutor showed the jury a photograph of the crawl space, with the ankle tracker lying on the dirt floor, a collective gasp went through the courtroom. Finch's defense was weak, pathetic. His lawyers tried to argue that he was a brilliant but misunderstood physician, collecting data for a research project on rare childhood diseases. The jury saw through the transparent lies. They were out for less than an hour. Guilty, on all counts. Attempted murder, insurance fraud, false imprisonment, and, after exhuming the bodies of 2 other children from his files, 2 counts of first-degree murder. At the sentencing, the judge, a stern woman with eyes that had seen the worst of humanity, removed her glasses and looked directly at Alistair Finch. "You are a disgrace to your profession, to your family, and to the human race," she said, her voice ringing with cold fury. "You wore a mask of compassion to hide a heart of pure avarice. You took an oath to do no harm, and you twisted it into a license to kill the most innocent among us. You are not a doctor. You are a monster who hid behind a stethoscope. Society must be protected from you, permanently." She sentenced him to multiple life sentences, to be served consecutively, without the possibility of parole. He would die in prison. As he was led away, he looked not remorseful, but merely annoyed, as if he had been inconvenienced by a minor traffic violation. The fallout in Harmony Creek was significant. The town's collective psyche was shattered. The man they had revered as a saint was a serial killer. Officer Miller was suspended and ultimately fired for gross negligence. The entire department was placed under state review, leading to mandatory retraining on child welfare cases. And in the state capitol, a new piece of legislation was fast-tracked. It mandated an automatic, independent investigation into the death of any child whose legal guardian was also a direct financial beneficiary. The press, in a rare moment of poetic justice, nicknamed it Leo's Law. The system, broken and blind, had been shocked into correcting itself. In the immediate aftermath, Leo was taken to the hospital. He was severely malnourished and dehydrated, but physically, he would recover. The emotional scars, however, ran deep. He barely spoke. He flinched at loud noises and sudden movements. The state's Child Protective Services stepped in, preparing to place him in the foster care system. He had no other family. He was utterly alone. But he wasn't. The day he was due to be discharged from the hospital, a crowd was waiting for him. The guardians of the innocent stood vigil in the parking lot, a silent promise that he would never be unprotected again. And at the front of the crowd stood Sarah, the waitress. Her husband, a gentle, burly mechanic named Tom, stood beside her, his arm around her. Sarah had made a call to counsel, the club's lawyer, the day after the arrest. "We want him," she had said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tom and we can't have children of our own. We have a good home. We have so much love to give. Please, can you help us?" Counsel had handled everything. He cut through the bureaucratic red tape with the precision of a surgeon. He filed the emergency custody papers. He presented the court with character references, financial statements, and a home study that was completed in record time. When the social worker brought Leo out, he saw the crowd and shrank back, his fear returning. But then he saw Sarah. He remembered her kind face from the diner. And then he saw Bear, standing beside her, his massive frame a bulwark against the world. Sarah knelt down, so she was at his eye level. "Hi, Leo," she said softly. "My name is Sarah. My husband Tom and we were wondering if you'd like to come and stay with us for a while." Leo looked from her to Bear, then back to her. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The club didn't just fade away. Their promise was not a temporary one. The day Sarah and Tom brought Leo home, a convoy of bikes followed them. The guardians descended on the small house. The electrician, Sparky, rewired the entire house, bringing it up to code. Deacon, the ex-detective, installed a state-of-the-art security system. The club's treasurer presented Sarah with a cashier's check that paid off her mortgage in full. Another check established a trust fund for Leo's education, funded by the club's treasury and anonymous donations from its members. They filled the pantry, stocked a freezer, and built a brand new swing set in the backyard. They were not just saviors, they were family. 2 years passed. The sun was warm on a perfect Saturday afternoon. The air was filled with the sounds of a Little League baseball game, the crack of the bat, the cheers of the crowd, the umpire's call. On the pitcher's mound for the Harmony Creek Hornets stood a 10-year-old boy. He was no longer the pale, thin ghost from the diner. He was lean and strong, his face bright with concentration and the joy of the game. His name was Leo. He wound up and threw a perfect fastball. Strike 3, the batter was out. The crowd erupted. In the stands, Sarah and Tom were cheering wildly, jumping up and down. Sarah's face was wet with happy tears. Tom was bellowing with pride. And sitting in the section of bleachers next to them, taking up nearly the entire space, was a familiar group. It was Bear, Sarge, Deacon, Glitch, and a dozen other members of the Guardians. They wore their vests, their patches gleaming in the sun. They were the loudest, most boisterous fans in the stadium. They were Leo's uncles, his grandfathers, his protectors. Later in the game, Leo came up to bat. The bases were loaded. The Hornets were down by 2 runs. The pressure was immense. He stepped into the batter's box, took a deep breath, and looked up into the stands. His eyes found Bear. Bear sat perfectly still amidst the cheering. He didn't shout or wave. He simply met the boy's gaze and gave him a slow, encouraging nod. The same nod he had given Sarah in the diner 2 years ago. It was a promise. "You've got this. I'm here." Leo smiled, a huge, brilliant, confident smile. He turned back to the pitcher, his focus absolute. The first pitch was a ball. The second, a strike. The third pitch came in fast and low. Leo swung. The crack of the bat was explosive. The ball soared through the air, a white speck against the brilliant blue sky. It flew over the shortstop's head, over the center fielder's head, and over the fence. A grand slam. As Leo rounded the bases, his feet barely touching the ground, he looked back at the stands. He saw his mom and dad hugging, crying, laughing all at once. He saw his uncles, a sea of leather and denim, on their feet, roaring with approval. He saw Bear, who was now standing, a rare, genuine smile finally reaching his tired, watchful eyes. That night, as Sarah tucked him into bed, in his own room filled with books and toys and posters of his favorite baseball players, Leo said something he had never said before. "Mom?" he asked, his voice soft. "Yes, sweetie," Sarah said, her heart swelling at the word. "Why does Bear have sad eyes?" Sarah sat on the edge of his bed. She thought for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Well," she began, I think Bear lost someone a long time ago. Someone he loved very much, and it left a hole in his heart." "Like the hole in my heart?" Leo asked, his voice small. "Yes," Sarah said, stroking his hair, "just like that. But you know what? You're helping to fill that hole for him, and he's helping to fill yours. That's what family does. They help fill the empty spaces." Leo thought about this. He looked at the baseball trophy on his nightstand. He looked at the picture of him with all his uncles, taken after the game. "Okay," he said, and snuggled down under the covers. "Good night, Mom." "Good night, my love," she whispered, and kissed his forehead. She walked out into the hallway, closing the door softly behind her. Tom was waiting for her, and he wrapped her in a hug. Outside, parked across the street, was a single, silent motorcycle. It would be there until dawn, a quiet guardian watching over the house, where a boy who had been lost in the darkness was finally learning to dream in the light. Heroes don't always wear capes or badges. Sometimes, They wear leather and ride motorcycles. Sometimes, they're a waitress who refuses to look away. Evil often wears a respectable mask, hiding in plain sight, protected by reputation and the unwillingness of good people to believe the unthinkable. But it is the duty of the watchful, the brave, the ones who have known their own darkness, to see past the mask. It is their duty to listen to the silent screams, to see the fear in a child's eyes, and when the call comes, to answer. It is their duty to be someone's bear.